Greetings and thank you for joining me. On this exploration, we're going to be taking a closer look at Buffalo, New York. In Buffalo, New York, on the Great Lakes, right here at the tip of Lake Erie, a lot of the early days of civilization surrounding the creation of the Erie Canal, which I have covered on this channel previously. We also got into the Finger Lakes here. But let's take a closer look at Buffalo. And Buffalo, one of those interesting cities that has a higher population at the turn of the 20th century than it does now. You can see we have a peak population of around 600,000 in 1950 before. A real steep decline, halving of the population from that time period on. Very interesting. So let's look at those early days of Buffalo. And we're going to take a little bit of a different angle in this video, and we're going to assume that all this is completely plausible and built the way we are told. This is the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, German insurance building. We'll see as we move forward. This is a Liberty Bank. We'll also see a bit more of that as we move forward. This I found a very interesting photo. So the shipping and transportation of grain, a very early driver in the booming economy of Buffalo. Here's an early, I don't know, looks like a grain elevator, some sort of industrial building. Check this out. Got the rail lines underneath this, so this is a moving structure. What a very unique, interesting looking structure. But of course, since we have looked at so many of those old cities on the Great Lakes, we know what to expect from this area, and of course Buffalo does not disappoint. We have no shortage of towers and domes, because at that time period it was a part of the style that these people wanted to convey, these architects. They wanted to show what they could do. And of course, the people of the time were such skilled craftsmen that it wasn't really any problem for them to build this way. In fact, they knew no other way, really. So they built high schools with the cupola. And they had these multi-storied buildings at a very early time period. Many of them dating back into the 1800s, according to the historical record, the late 1800s. That last decade of the 1800s was a real booming time in the Americas. There were buildings going up everywhere you looked, and I'm not just talking about 1 or 2 story shacks. I'm talking about Roman temples and castles and anything you can think of, you name it. Water towers that reach to the skies. Speaking of castles, here we have one of the armories that you're likely to find in Buffalo, the 74th Regiment Armory. And it was standard practice for them to build armories to look like castles, like you're seeing here. Not a difficult task, because like I said, these people were master builders and master architects. And really, whatever the architect was able to draw, these builders were able to achieve. Even before we had things like electricity for power tools, or the internal combustion engine, or hydraulic power. These were all things that were achievable because of the ability of the people, and it really, as a modern day human being, makes me feel small. But that's okay, because we have so much more than that they didn't have. Like technology. The 65th Regiment Armory. Now this is an interesting one too, because we see this without the tower, and we see it with the tower in some other depictions. Here it is without the tower. There it is with the tower. Confusing. Has this been added for the purpose of the postcard? Why on earth would you do that? You have to wonder, don't you? And of course they knew how to build like this because most of them were European immigrants that had gotten used to living around these castles and building these castles in their homeland. So it was really very easy for them to transplant their skills. Because you're seeing here a construction photo which confirms that this was built in the time period that the photo was taken. There could be no other explanation for why we would have a construction photo. Oh, look at that horse and buggy. That horse is hovering above the snow, I suppose. I half expected half the wheel to be buried in the snow. Or at the very least the bottom part, but not to worry, not to worry. That's not something that's not a photo that's been tampered with. That's a completely legit construction photo. Why would you ever doubt it? There's the armory again, minus the tower. Here we're looking at an asylum, the Buffalo Asylum, designed by H.H. Richardson, one of the greatest architects of all time. Designed more buildings in his lifetime than you could ever imagine or conceive of doing yourself, because he had superhuman powers. Now, one thing you need to know about this time period is that it did make a lot of people crazy, and they were kept in these wonderful castles that were built for this purpose, to house the insane, the people that couldn't function in this society that was changing so rapidly at the time. And they had all sorts of effective methods to treat these people at the time. Everything was actually safe and effective in these asylums. And we're the better for it as a society. Here's the Blessed Trinity Church. This is a fantastic looking structure. And as we look a little closer and peer into the brickwork, you can tell that builders of the time really wanted you to scratch your head and wonder how they achieved such a look. And I think they were successful in that mission. And of course the interior of these churches are magnificent because it was God who was in charge of the build. And the parishioners and the ones who built these structures had God working through them. He sure did. But no, this was built by a poor people, poor builders and workers that toiled daily and often relieved their pain with alcohol in the evenings, as you do in the construction industry. Because that was life back then, and much of it is life nowadays. But they were still able to achieve such feats, because the drawings the architects provided for them were impeccable and very, very easy to follow. This is the Erie County Savings Bank, or the Erie Savings and Loan building. Now there is a video of this being demolished in the 60s on YouTube, and I'll put the link in the description. They say that the walls were about 6 feet thick at the base. And the construction, or the demolition of this thing, went on for months. So a lot of work to demolish one of these old structures. Here we have the electric building. Now again, the early time period. This one built in 1912 in the Beaux-Arts style. One of those fantastic early 20th century styles they loved to build with at the time. 14 stories. Here we have an early electricity building, not to be confused with the electric tower we just saw. Now its proximity to the Niagara Falls would put Buffalo on the map for one of the early cities to receive electricity. In fact, we are told that 1881 saw the first electric company, the Brush Electric Light Company of Buffalo, install the first electric plant there. That's a very early time period for electricity. And of course, at the time, there was a real problem with people having children of their own. So they were provided with these facilities that had the technology to hold infants in incubators. And it was a place you could go if you were looking for a child. Now, where these children came from, I'm not sure. But I do know that the Foundling Wheel was an interesting part of that time period as well. I'll put a link to Foundling Wheels in the description as well, and you can dive into that if you like. Now, before that electricity was really spread far and wide here in Buffalo, we had the we had the rail lines in and on the streets, but the electricity hadn't been turned on yet, so they were pulled by horses. And you can see what they're doing here is collecting people for the insane asylum. And you really wouldn't know who deserved to be, or who needed that kind of treatment in the asylum. It really could have been anyone. Could have been you, or it could have been I. Hotel Iroquois, I believe, which we will take a closer look at. And this Erie building really stays with us, doesn't it? There's something about the texture of the roof line. They really enjoyed to decorate the peaks of these cones. And they had these fanciful designs, let's say, by the architects, put on the peaks of these domes and cones. Quite a nice look, I would suggest. Unfortunately, not really having any function, it was all really for aesthetics only. The style of the time, let's call it. And of course, they used very, very large stones for the bridge work at that early time period here in Buffalo. Much of the waterfront even looking scaped with these short walls. Because, of course, remember, the canals were being built. And at that time, these canals were being built in several places at the early 1800s. Again, not a difficult feat, despite the fact that the canals were hardly used because of the advent of the railroad. It sounds like there was quite a lack of vision for the future, for the people at the time, not to have foreseen what was coming. The Jackknife Bridge, what a very interesting visual this provides for us as well. There's that grain facility, and very interesting looking structure, very heavy duty looking infrastructure here at the Jackknife Bridge. Now, because it was a very sinful lifestyle that many of the people at the time led, they really needed to cleanse themselves of those sins on a weekly basis. So you'll see no shortage of churches and chapels and cathedrals here in Buffalo. They also had a very early zoo, which curiously contains buildings that look like they're ruined castles. Of course, that would have been easy to do because we knew that they were able to build castles at the time everywhere. Here we have the Builders Exchange, looking like it's coming out of the 1800s. Multi-storied building, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 stories with a basement. Not a difficult task for that time period again, and not really taking long to build these structures. I believe this is a Presbyterian church. And the residence of the wealthy elite of the time, those industrialists and capitalists, was really beyond understanding. And they were capable of building these castle-style homes, just as we were capable of building the armories and the government buildings. Here we have a city and county hall, an early city hall. We'll be looking at 2 city halls in this video. And we have a post office and federal building. Really, you needed to have something like this for the delivery of mail and other goods that went through the post. And the beauty of that post office, really not the exception at all at the time, it was the rule. And again, we see more of that stonework and infrastructure in the waterways. Some beautiful markets in Buffalo as well. Here we see the Clinton Market and the Broadway Market. There is a Washington Street Market as well, which we will be seeing. But we will continue to move forward. And all different faiths present in early Buffalo, perfectly happy to live side by side and continue to construct these majestic cities. We have an early central station. There it is again from another angle, a postcard dating to 1910. We have the central terminal. And I'm reading that it was decided to build this structure in 1925. They began to clear the ground the following year, 1926. And by 1928, 2 years later, this thing was operational. And they had to make it like a tower, because why wouldn't you? Because you need it to look like a tower, so you could see that terminal from miles away as your train approached. And in 1928, they decided to clad the ceiling and walls in arched brick. Again, because you had so many of those European immigrants around with those skilled hands that they were easily able to accomplish such a feat. And it is said that one of the builders at the time deviated from the plan of the architect and decided to go with the herringbone on the ceiling for this portion. And although the architect was upset at the time, it is said that eventually the architect was willing to accept the design and agreed that it looked fitting of the rest of the building. Isn't that a nice story? And of course we know it was built at that time period because we have a dated photo here. And it really clarifies everything for us. And of course it was a very, very white looking sky at the time. But that's just the way that photographs were taken at that time period. Very interesting though. We see here this one taken supposedly from April 10th of that year. And this construction photo taken 15 days later. And they really were moving quite quickly, weren't they? Had to be. The central terminal in Buffalo. Postcard of the Chamber of Commerce. You've got a little dome on the corner. That's style points to the architect for adding the little dome. The Chippewa Market. This might be the third one I was talking about. There's also St. Michael's Cathedral we'll be looking at a little later on. Yes, I mentioned the churches. All sorts of denominations. So really something for everybody of every faith in the Western world anyway, let's say, here in Buffalo. There it is again, that Presbyterian church I showed you earlier. And I believe that this was put together by those same builders of castles, but more as a weekend project because their main projects had to do with some of the other larger structures. So this was really just a side job for a handful of European builders at the time. And it was something they liked to do in their spare time because really all they like to do is build. They really didn't have any other interests or abilities. So they just built these castles and structures. They built and built and built and built. And there's the St. Joseph's Cathedral in an earlier time period with its tower. And there was some discussion in the town at that early time period that tower needed to be removed because it posed such a grave danger to the citizens below that might be crushed when it toppled over in a strong wind. Thankfully, they took that tower down. And of course, a lot of the interior work done by the older European immigrants who had a lot of memory of the cathedrals back home and were able to duplicate this by memory. And here again we have the St. Michael's Church Tower. And the same logic applies to this one. This church was shortened over the years to keep the citizens safe. You can see how many more levels are here than here. And thankfully, safety is the number one concern in our modern day. St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Joseph's Cathedral. And there's also the pipe organs. There was a good handful of pipe organ specialists in Buffalo. In fact, they were in almost every city you look at that time period. The number of pipe organs that existed at that time is much larger than it is nowadays. St. Joseph's Cathedral. And we are not finished. This is the Westminster Presbyterian Church with quite a steep cone-shaped roof with copper lining and flashing on the seams and intricately decorated and finished on the interior. Then we get to the first City Hall. Now this one took them 4 years to put together, not long after the American Civil War. And it did take them a little bit longer than you'd expect for that time period. Often these buildings go up in about 2 years. But they really wanted to take their time and do it right on this occasion. And thankfully they did take that extra time, because this building does still stand. And it's quite spectacular. Perfectly symmetrical. Very ornate. And of course it's got one of those decorative features on the peak. The D.S. Morgan building, we've seen it a few times, sitting next to the Erie Savings and Loan. And there again we get a good look at the mode of transportation at that time period, using the horses and the carts and the very rickety looking wheels, but really investing all of their energy into building the structures around them. The method of transportation could wait. We hop back over to the electric tower just to show you this thing lit up like a Christmas tree, and to show you that it does still stand as well. And again, very nicely decorated. Over 100 years ago, these people were up here on their wooden scaffolds, slipping these stones into place and capping this with a ball. Here we're taking a look at the electric tower featured in the Pan American Exposition of 1901 in Buffalo. And this looking like the demolition process. Now, although these buildings at these World Fairs look amazingly ornate and strong structurally, they weren't. They were temporary buildings made out of staff and easily destroyed afterward. Not a difficult task to build something like this if it's meant to be temporary. So there really is no mystery to the World's Fairs. It really is just a product of the architects of the time and the ability and ingenuity of the people. No need to look any further into the World's Fairs. Here we have the Ellicott Square building. And despite its immense size, this building was completed in 1896. Really a massive structure. And let's take a look at the building materials, because oh wow, those are some fancy building materials, looking very timeless, looking like it could be much older than we're being told. But what a large building to have constructed in 1896. And then all through that 130-year period, we don't see much deterioration of the materials themselves, which really speaks to the people of the time and their ability to get things done and do things properly. And we know they were building this at that time because we have a couple construction photos. Here we have a date from July 17th, 1895. A year before this thing was completed in 1896. That's good to know. And we do have another construction photo of this Ellicott Square building. And you can see here the horses and the workers hard at work to dig out the hole to get this building up. You can also see the age of the structures around it. And again, a look at what they were able to complete in about a year from this photo here. A year later, they had this. Isn't that amazing? We're truly spectacular people. And really, it's because they lived in a time before iPhones and computers. They had so much more time to dedicate to these crafts. And that fully explains how these were constructed. And here we can see in November of that same year. So we have July of 95 until November. So what is that? August, September, October. 4 months later, we have this structure up. And we have the stone, and we're almost complete. Of course, it looks like they forgot to connect that portion, but never mind, we'll keep moving forward. And a little look at the interior of that structure, just to give you an idea of the steel work involved. And of course, everything having detail, everything made to be looked at. Beautiful. And we have, of course, old bell towers, which were also commonplace at the time. Because the people were so religious, it was such a large part of their lives back then. In this building, we must show Fidelity and Trust. Very ornately detailed on the interior. Fantastic woodwork here. The woodworkers of the late 1800s are really put everybody in the modern day to shame, even with all of our technology. They're calling this the Old Castle or Fort Porter. Fort Porter. Alright, we get to a real beauty, the German insurance building, looking like it was built somewhere around 1880. Iron-fronted building, we're told. Ornately decorated here on the top, and this definitely built by the Germans in the area. Only the Germans would have been able to pull something like this off. And they had to build it for their insurance. And of course there were some serious wrought iron workers at the time that did all sorts of decorative finials, could we call them? Look at this right here. Take a look at that. Isn't that beautiful? Drawn up by the architect in 1880 and placed atop the peak of that roof. God bless all the architects of the 1800s. Guaranty building, and I did another video on this. Certainly worth a look. Quite a spectacular structure. You can't really tell from this photo, although you get an idea of what we're looking at. Multi-storied structure, again going back into the 1800s. Here we have a better look at some of the detail as it stands here in modern day. Also known as the Prudential building. You can see the writing there. And you can see that every square inch of this structure is covered with detail, as it was common to do at the time. This is a very easy feature to accomplish at that time period. All you had to do is have the architect draw it up, and they would make the tiles, and it was easy as stacking Lego. Really nothing to marvel or awe at. Just a different time, folks. I think it's the smartest bet is to put all your faith and trust in the historical narrative that we are told to believe. I think believing anything else really will get you into scary places. We don't want to be scared, do we? The Lafayette Hotel. Hotel Buffalo, looking very similar to that Guaranty building. Again, if I zoom in, you get an idea of what it may have looked like. Another hotel, the Iroquois, or Iroquois, depending on how you say it. Locals will get me in the comments for that one. Thank you, locals, for keeping me on my toes. Very beautiful mansard roof consisting of 3 stories with multiple dormers coming off, and of course each dormer had to have a little ball placed at the peak, because it cost nothing extra to do these small things, to add these details at the time. And of course the interior had to live up to the exterior, if not exceed. Lafayette Theater now. Now back at that time frame, it was very important to take in your entertainment. We know there were multiple opera houses in the late 1800s, and many of these theaters that of course were very ornately decorated, indicating how important that entertainment really was for the people at the time. Now, we are to believe that they were working, building these structures, and getting their industries on their feet, but they still had time to let loose and watch a few shows. And then when you build a train station, it was par for the course to make it look like either like a castle or an ancient Roman building of some sort. And it really is all just attributed to the style of the time. Nothing more. Here we're looking at the Liberty National Bank. Built in 1925, the roaring 20s. Sure did roar, didn't they, in the 20s? Building these structures. And still retaining that ability to finish the interiors, something we have lost in this modern day. But in the roaring 20s, it was still par for the course in the construction process. And there you see, is it Lady Liberty? What, does that look like a lady? I wonder. Much more to that story. But you can see the detail, and you can see that it's made from brick. And we have a library, not making it 100 years. And that was also very typical. When the 60s came around, progress really was the name of the game. And so many of these old structures that at that time would be pushing 60, 70, 80 years old really had no place in society anymore and had to be torn down. So society undertook the demolishing of the past to a large extent in the 60s. And what do we have as a result? We have progress. are all the better for it. It looks like here in Buffalo they saw fit to build a high school next to the armory. Oh, I've jumped around a bit, but this would be the new City Hall. We have some very accurate historical information on the structure. On September 16, 1929, construction on this building begun, and it was ultimately completed on November 10, 1931. So, just over 2 years to create this structure, and completely plausible timeline in the year of 1929 to 1931. So, right after the stock market crash, they decide in Buffalo to keep everybody busy and build this structure. What an amazing thing to do for the people of your city. Fantastic. And it looks like the type of project that was added to many times, finishing every square inch of it with all this intricate detail, keeping the people of Buffalo employed. Bravo. Something that went on in many of these places at that time period after the crash. A couple of lakeside hotels. Another look at that City Hall, the first City Hall. And the YMCA looking like many of the old YMCAs I've come across in my research. I spoke briefly about the World's Fair, and we don't really need to talk anymore about the World's Fair because it's obvious that the World's Fairs were just temporary and nothing more to say about them really. Let's keep moving forward. Here we're looking at the Pierce's Palace Hotel. Of course, having a tower because you have to have a tower. And the post office with another tower. And I have heard in the 1800s it was cheaper to build with a tower than without. Now go figure, but logically it makes sense when we look at the photos from that time period. So you have to wonder. And it also didn't really cost them anything extra to put an eagle on top of these little peaks. The post office and federal building. You have again that megalithic blockwork that many of the locals were capable of doing in the 1800s. And we come to the Savings Bank, built in 1899, completed in 1901, 2-year building time, much like the new City Hall we looked at. And it was very important to build banks like this to gain trust in the people. It really does look like a place that will save your savings and keep that secure. And that was very important in the banks of yesteryear. And you can imagine how competitive that would have been, all the banks having to outdo each other to make it a more appealing place to store your wealth, store the wealth of the people. So the Buffalo Savings Bank really achieving that goal and gaining trust in the people. The high schools of the day. This is the Central High School. Of course, remember how cheap it was to put towers up. Making perfect sense to put a tower, several towers in fact, on the old high schools. And you can see here that timeline again, lasting about 60 years, and the progress of the 19 teens really doing away with this structure. Thankfully, they were able to build newer looking structures, sleek and modern, with clean lines. So many of these schools, old schools, heavily fortified in case of attack. we come to the Lafayette School. Here, let's look at the old photo first with the cupola on top and many other cupolas. This is a beautiful structure, looking like it still stands to this day. As we zoom in, we can see a lot of the what might be terracotta or some sort of concrete polymer decorative features on top of the brick, with the copper flashing down the ridges, and the copper decorative styling up here. Something you would expect to see in a school from this time period. And this is a little rah 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 for the Lafayette High School. Our team will beat your team. And you can see the copper cupolas here as well. Now we saw this one next to the Armory, the Mazdon Park High School, with an observatory no less. Let's take a closer look at that. You can see the hatch here for opening up and looking up into the heavens. An added feature, a bonus feature in the construction process of the early high schools. And of course, a tragedy struck this high school, like so many other tragedies and fires that struck many of these old world buildings. And then we will be told that this is the high school that replaced it, the new Mazdon Park High School. And yet another school. So that really the education process, so important at that turn of the century time period. Here's that South Park High School as it stands today, with the upper columns, a very common feature in old world structures as well. We are looking at the State Normal School. Many of the early normal schools apparently were the teaching of the teachers to make sure that all the curriculum was aligned, let's say. That everybody was sort of walking that same path. Now, I did a video on the normal schools, Horace Mann, the Inheritors series. If you haven't seen that, I encourage you to check that out. And we are still looking at schools in Buffalo. Can you believe it? We're getting close to the end of the file here. And we're just going to keep moving forward. Here we have the Shays Theater, looking like it still stands. Difficult to really glean what it looks like from the outside, and as we look at the inside we get a real taste of, again, how important it was for the people of Buffalo to ornately decorate the interior of their entertainment venue. Of course, hospitals also taking advantage of the tower deal of the time. And it allowed your building to be seen from many, many miles away, which was a nice added feature in that architecture of the time as well. Looking like we have a school, college and a school attached to each other here. Angels Academy. This would be the Orphans Asylum. You needed a place to keep those orphans. Perhaps it was all the infants that never really found a home, that were being incubated. At the very least, they could be kept at the orphanages and raised to function in this society. And the Teachers College, a place to teach the teachers yet again. We saw this temple earlier, Temple Beth Zion. We come to the Temple of Music, one of these structures from the World's Fair, Buffalo World's Fair 1901. We're told here the place where President McKinley was shot. And you have to think it must have been quite the structure to be temporary, yet still look like this. Here you can see the pipe organ outfitted in that building. Temporary structure, really nothing to write home about because it was only made to stand for a very short period of time. And we know this because we have construction photos such as this that tell us that's what went on. You can see them working up there, posing maybe for the shot up here on their little tow board on the roof. There's a closer look at the pipe organ, which was constructed for that temporary World's Fair. And there's a look at the finished product and the attendees at that event. And we have to mark these type of events with monuments such as this. Alright, let's move on. A handful more photos. The Blotcher Mansion, the Lenox Hotel, Lenox in 1911, horse and buggy. The old telephone building, we call it the old telephone building. You can see here we have a lower level, multi-storied. It's old because this is the new telephone building. And you can really get a sense of the immensity of this structure. Because building 10-story buildings at the turn of the 20th century was actually quite common and quite easy to accomplish. And our final building in our file is a YMCA. Multi-storied, beautiful building with columns and all sorts of decorative features. And really nothing really jumps out at me, much like many of the other YMCAs. Very easy to construct for that time period. So I hope you enjoyed this look at Buffalo. It really is nothing new. It was just the way that they built at that period of time. And I certainly don't encourage you to look into the World's Fair, because there really is nothing more to see with that narrative except for what you've been told. So thank you for watching.